Well, good afternoon. We are taking a break here at the courthouse in Walterboro in the murder trial of Alex Murdaugh. The closing arguments underway here in earnest. And just moments ago, we heard Creighton Waters really lay into the timeline of Alex Murdaugh on the night of the murders, June the 7th, 2021. Waters earlier on talking a lot about the motive evidence in this case, but this afternoon was certainly some of the more compelling arguments that he made before this jury, talking about the timeline and Alex Murdaugh's lie of ever being at the kennels and hammering all of those lies surrounding that 844 video from Paul Murdaugh's cell phone at the kennels, which is the most compelling piece of evidence in this case. He was saying, why would an innocent person ever lie about being at the kennels, after all, if he didn't even know when the murders took place? And this was a lie that he was telling from the get-go. This was something that he said from the witness stand a few days ago, that he in fact had lied about that. And much of Creighton Waters' argument this afternoon centered on just that fact, talking about how Alex Murdaugh couldn't remember some of the details surrounding his trip down to the kennels that night at 844, said he can't remember the conversations that he had with Maggie Murdaugh, the final conversation, in fact, that he had with his wife and with his son, that he went straight down there and straight back, and called it, in one moment, called it the fastest chicken and dog chase ever, just kind of poking holes in Alex Murdaugh's new story, a new story that he described in detail. He also mentioned the family weapon that was used to kill Maggie Murdaugh, a .300 blackout weapon. There were shell casings found outside the gun room months prior that matched the casings found around Maggie Murdaugh's body. They were cycled through the same weapon. Creighton Waters highlighting that. And Judy, one of the most important points in his whole presentation was appealing to emotion. I felt as he talked to the jury, saying that in the final moments of Maggie Murdaugh's life, she was running to her baby.
Yes.
This was the type of language that you need to make in a closing argument to a jury, to understand that these were real people, a real mother who's concerned about her son after hearing gunshots, running toward her baby, and then Creighton Waters describing just the horror that she must have felt, seeing that it was in fact Alex Murdaugh that was doing this. I felt that that was a very important component in all of this.
You know what, Greg, that is such an astute observation, because the emotional moments in this trial have been from defense witnesses and from Alex Murdaugh himself, who gets emotional literally every time Maggie or Paul's name is mentioned in court. So that did seem to be an effort, at least, by the prosecution to sort of sway some emotion their way as they talked about Maggie. And Creighton Waters really zoomed in on Alex Murdaugh and really walked the jury through every single lie that he told and a timeline of the lies, and said that he lied early on, talking about that 1 a.m. interview shortly after the murders, saying he lied instantly, and then months later in the August interview. So he pointed out all of those lies and pointed out, in his opinion, how effortlessly he lied about those circumstances, and at one point said that Alex Murdaugh keeps coming up with a new story to confront the facts of this case.
That's right, yeah.
The facts that he cannot explain.
Yep, he mentioned the moment that only when confronted with the evidence of that cell phone video did his story change. But we wanted to play that moment for you, that powerful moment in Creighton Waters' closing argument when he described Maggie Murdaugh's final moments. Let's take a listen.
Because Maggie sees what happens and she comes running over there, running to her baby. Probably the last thing on her mind, thinking that it was him who had done this. She's running to her baby while he's picked up the blackout and opens fire at close range, again with no defensive wounds. And she takes those two shots that you heard Dr. Reber say were parallel, and it crumples her over. In those cases, you can see them move around, and takes that shot that goes through here, and she goes down flat, and then there's the shot in the back of the head.
And back out here live, certainly an emotional moment there, but also he appealed to some different arguments that he has not mentioned to this point. 5.5 weeks, and only in this closing argument did he mention the possibility that Alex Murdaugh washed off at the kennels. There was some of that came up in the testimony about the misplaced hose. You heard the kennel keeper talk about how it was a little bit off. But it was Creighton Waters today who said that it would have been very easy for Alex Murdaugh to hose himself off down at the kennels. He also mentioned and asked the question, why was he in such a hurry that night? That flurry of activity from 9:02 to 9:06, hurriedly getting out of the house, heading to his mom's at Alameda, hurriedly driving down the road at 80 miles per hour. Of course, at that key moment, slowing down when prosecutors say he ditched the cell phone. But also, the question was, why did he go to Alameda by himself? And why, in many ways, didn't he drive by the kennels? That was one of the key questions. If you're so concerned about your wife and you're calling her on the phone from the house, why not just drive by the kennels to say that you're on your way to Alameda?
Excellent point, Greg. We're also bringing in, as promised, our expert trial analysis from trial attorney Carl B. Grant. Carl, we've already been hearing from viewers who want to know your assessment of this closing argument. Before we get to that, because you gave us kind of an idea of what you felt would be effective in terms of a closing argument yesterday, so we'll get an assessment on Creighton Waters in just a moment, and then we're going to be checking in with our Nick Neville as well. But picking up on the point Greg was just making, one of the points that Creighton Waters made that resonated with me was that if you talk to anybody who has lost a loved one, regardless of what those circumstances were, you remember what your last words to them were. You remember that last conversation, and Alex Murdaugh's memory was so vivid about where he put his phone in his car in his compartment, but he could not remember his last words to his wife.
People have a tendency, Judy, as you know, to remember traumatic events. You can think about where you were exactly when you found out about 9/11 and the World Trade Center. Exactly what you were doing, exactly where you were, even the clothes that you were wearing. What can be more traumatic than your wife and your son being found murdered? So if you can't remember that, the question becomes why. But let's face it, folks, this case has become a single issue case. That is, do you or do you not believe Alex Murdaugh? If you believe him, then he's acquitted. If the jury does not believe him, he's convicted. It's just that simple.
And Carl, that's such a great point, because at the end, really what prosecutors wanted to do was make this a referendum on Alex Murdaugh's character. They did it by way of bringing in some of the financial evidence in this case, but they wanted to keep it very tightly on Alex Murdaugh and his relationship with the truth and the many times in which he lied repeatedly. Of course, the defense wanted to get away from that, and they wanted to make the onus on the investigation. They wanted to talk about perhaps some of SLED's shortcomings in this, but ultimately placing it right back where it belongs in this case, on Alex Murdaugh, his version of events, and of course, a massive lie that he told about ever being at the kennels that
That's
night.
right. And let's not forget, Greg, regardless of SLED's investigation or the problems with it, there certainly were deficiencies, no doubt about that. But here's the point. If you believe he committed the crime, the jury's going to overlook those deficiencies. And the question is, did he tell a lie? Well, he's an admitted liar. He's been on the witness stand and told the jury that he lied. And then when they called the retired chief of police, he established that he not only lied, but he lied on the witness stand.
He told about getting the blue lights installed on his car.
That's right, in the very presence of the jury, while the jury is right there observing him. And I've made an argument before, and here it is. If a man will tell that kind of lie while you're watching him from the jury box, what will he do when nobody else is around?
And that is the question.
I think Paul just dropped the mic on y'all over there. He just dropped the mic. Let me ask you this before we toss to our Nick Neville. Creighton Waters, in terms of his performance, connection with the jury, delivering these closing arguments today after the first break, when part one of the closing arguments, some of the other attorneys around here said, I don't know, maybe they should have let the attorney general do it. But he did bring more emotion. He was more animated, if you will, during part two. What's your assessment?
That's right. Well, the first part of the closing argument was like kind of what the other attorneys were thinking. He was primarily giving a lecture. That's the way I felt. But now, the second part, I did see emotion. I saw what you talked about, Greg, bringing the emotion in of a child being killed, the mother running to her child, using the word running to her baby. That grabs at you, and that's what grabs the jury. So I thought he did a much better job.
Yeah, and of course, that closing argument is not yet concluded. We're just taking a break in court right now. It's going to be about 15 minutes long.
Okay.
Creighton Waters will finish up. He's been at it now for about 3.5, 4 hours.
12:15, about 12:14, 12:15 was when he started, and we're on the second break now. Our Nick Neville is a part of our live team coverage here as we get closer to this trial, this case going to the jury in the Murdaugh murders trial here on WIS. Nick, I know you've been watching every moment, and really you've been on this trial with Greg since the very beginning. What observations do you have from some of the observers here today?
Yes, Judy and Greg. So one of the things that really stuck out to me is just how Creighton Waters in the second half of the closing arguments was really sort of drilling down on all the lies that Alex Murdaugh told in the immediate aftermath of the slayings, including the night of the murders. He lied about his whereabouts in that first interview with David Owen, saying that he was never at the kennels. That's a lie that he kept up. That's a lie that he told his family. He told his brother, John Marvin. We later learned that John Marvin Murdaugh, from the stand, he testified that he actually was told by SLED that Alex's voice could be heard in that video at the kennels at 8:45. He was told that in August of 2022, but just a plethora of lies. Creighton Waters sort of picking out some key moments from Murdaugh's interviews with investigators. You'll remember as Murdaugh was testifying last week for a couple days from the stand, Murdaugh admitted that it was really sort of his opioid addiction and also paranoia and a distrust of SLED that led him to lie about his whereabouts just before the murders. And Creighton Waters was asking him several times, is this when you decided to lie? Is that when you decided to lie? And he played some of those moments from the first interview with investigators back again today. Another important point to touch on is that at one point Creighton Waters was talking about the alternate theories of the case that the defense has brought forward, and the alternate theory of the case that Alex Murdaugh himself brought forward from the stand when he was talking about how it was some vigilantes who came and committed these murders as sort of retribution for what had happened in the 2019 fatal boat crash involving Mallory Beach. Murdaugh claimed that it was, media-induced rumors and half-truths that led people to sort of see things on the internet to create a picture in their mind of who Paul was, who was not who he was, and he believes that is, he says he believes that is, why these murders occurred. Creighton Waters drilling down on that point just a few moments ago, saying that trials are about evidence, and you have seen no evidence, circumstantial or otherwise, that ties anyone related to the boat crash, anyone who had a vendetta against Paul related to the boat crash, that ties any of these people to the murders. He says, so again, look to those, look to where you can find evidence in this case. Try to use your common sense and determine on your own the credibility of these witnesses. You mentioned it briefly, Greg, but his timeline after the murders is another thing that Waters touched on briefly here. He was trying to drill down on why Murdaugh, in Waters' words, became such a busy guy around 9:02, and he was talking about how his steps really picked up at that point. That's when the prosecutors believe that Murdaugh was trying to essentially clean up after the murders. He also, of course, mentioned that this is the first time we heard him mention that he cleaned himself off at the kennels with that hose that we had learned had been moved from a previous witness who testified to that. But he was basically saying that Murdaugh was trying to establish an alibi, again, something that Murdaugh emphatically denied from the stand last week. But he was trying to say that Murdaugh was placing a plethora of short phone calls to Chris Wilson, to his brother John Marvin. And he's saying, at no point during those phone calls is he wondering where are Maggie and Paul. I was not able to get in touch with them. And of course, also highlighting that aspect of the fact that he was so close, as jurors found out today, he was so close to the kennels at the main house when he got up from his nap to go to visit his mom at the Almeida home. He was so close. Why not just take a look? Why not just go check down at the kennels and see if they were there, because he's calling Maggie and asking her where she is. So that's a question that is being posed to the jury. Is that reasonable, that Murdaugh would have just left and been in such a hurry Waters highlighting some of the data that we learned from Murdaugh's car that was newly obtained that sort of indicated that he was really speeding down those country roads that have deer and sort of treacherous roads. He was going full 75 miles an hour down those roads. And, at a certain point, Waters was also trying to highlight, think about why it would be that Murdaugh would lie so consistently and so adamantly for months about his whereabouts on the night of the kennels. This was a key exchange during the closing arguments. This is probably the strongest piece of evidence that the state has in this case. And so this is something that we expected Waters to highlight, and he certainly did. So we want to play a portion for you of that key exchange.
Being at the scene of the crime when the murders occurred. Opportunity. And more importantly, exposing the defendant's lies about the most important thing he could have told law enforcement. When was the last time I saw my wife and child alive? Why in the world would an innocent, reasonable father and husband lie about that? And lie about it so early?
Right, and so there, Creighton Waters touching on that key piece of evidence. Again, the state here does not have any direct evidence tying Alex Murdaugh to the crime. They do have a great deal of circumstantial evidence that the state hopes will lead to a conviction here. We still have yet to hear from defense attorney Jim Griffin, who's going to be laying out the defense's case here and why they believe that Murdaugh should be acquitted. So, that's going to be something that we're going to be watching for later. Of course, I think, we expect to hear Jim Griffin talk about how there's no direct evidence. We expect to hear him talk about this theory of two shooters. But that's, what we're expecting to hear. I want to send it back to you, Judy and Greg.
All right, Nick, thank you very much. And I'm glad you mentioned Jim Griffin, because during the break before we just came on air, I was on the phone with a very close source, a very good source, who says that it was Alex Murdaugh who requested that Jim Griffin do the closing. Many people thought it might be Dick Harpootlian. And we will have much more with attorney Carl Grant, because, Greg, we understand they're going back into the courtroom.
That's right. They're headed back into the courtroom. Want to pick up just a little bit of what Nick said, especially when you talk about at least some of the people that Alex Murdaugh was calling around that time period, shortly after 9 o'clock on the night of the murders. He called Rogan Gibson close to, 3 or 4 times. A FaceTime call, a phone call. Prosecutors are saying that this is a consciousness of guilt.
Yes.
Somebody who discovered Paul Murdaugh's cell phone that Creighton Waters said, did it just fall out of the pocket, as Alex Murdaugh claimed? But he was saying that he called Rogan Gibson several times before he ever called his son Buster, who was staying up in Rock Hill. But if they were so concerned, the inference here, if they were so concerned about there possibly being a vigilante or somebody out there that was coming after the family, why would you not call your only son and tell him to get to safety just as soon as possible? Yeah. That's one of the inferences from the prosecution. So that consciousness of guilt, Carl, that plays really high with the jury. I think it's a very strong point.
Yes, it is. And I'll tell you, the strongest point in argument for consciousness of guilt is when the defendant lies when he doesn't have to lie, or when he lies and he's clearly lying to protect himself. That clearly shows consciousness of guilt, and that is a very strong argument used by the prosecutor in a criminal case. So anytime the prosecutor can make that argument, he's going to make it, and make it emphatically.
Yeah. One of the other key things,
yes,
Judy, is when they were talking about Marion Proctor. Now, Alex Murdaugh told her that whoever did this thought about it for a really long time. Those are Alex Murdaugh's words. Let's listen back in to Creighton Waters as he finishes his closing argument.